Hello and welcome to my channel. This is going to be a two-part video. The drawing is somewhat larger and more complex. It's a drawing of a leopard done in colored pencils, and the second part will be available soon. In this one I'm going to be taking you through the drawing process up to this point, and I'm going to be talking about some of my tools and how I use them. It should be fun. Let's get to it. I'm going to start with an ivory colored pencil, and I'm going to lay down some of the strokes where the lighter hair will be. I don't know how much you'll be able to see because these do not really stand out too much against the white paper. I didn't use toned paper, I used white paper, so I don't really know if you can see these, but I wanted to put these down first because I'm going to be layering over them with some slightly darker colors, so I thought it would be useful to put down some lighter colors first. I already mentioned the size of the paper is a little bit bigger than usual. This is about 12 times 17 inches, so not only is this drawing more detailed than some of the usual drawings, it's also a little bit larger, so the drawing process is going to take a bit longer and it's going to require a little more patience. I'm now putting in some darker areas on the leopard's ears, and let me say a few words about the materials I'm using. The paper I'm using is 190 GSM smooth drawing paper, and the pencils that I'm using are Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. Those are the pencils I'm going to be using. And initially I was thinking about maybe putting down some clear gesso over the paper to make the paper a little more textured so that I would get more vibrant colors and maybe easier coverage of these larger areas, but I didn't really like the amount of texture that the clear gesso is producing, so I decided to work on the usual smooth drawing paper, and I think it turned out fine for the most part, except for the fact that it was quite a bit slower than I expected, but that's just the way it is when you're working with colored pencils. I'm drawing these darker patches of fur, and let me just explain how I'm doing this. I'm going to grab a piece of paper here and show you. I basically make these short back and forth strokes, and you can see that I'm doing this very carelessly, but I have to worry about the direction in which the fur grows, and I also have to pay attention to the length of the fur. So I can't make my strokes too long, and I have to match the direction of the strokes with the direction in which the fur grows. And another thing I can do is also I can refine those shapes a little bit, and I can add some other colors to them, like for example this burnt sienna, because these dark patches of fur on leopards, tigers and other cats are not really black, they're more like dark brown or dark ochre. So I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to keep drawing those patches of darker fur, and the reason why I like to do that first is because that really helps me navigate through the entire drawing, especially when the drawing is this large. It kind of makes the drawing process a little bit easier for me when I know where some of the darker areas are. Now, if I were working with pastels, this would probably be a problem because as I would go with lighter areas in between those darker areas, there would be a lot more smudging. But with colored pencils, this is not as much of a problem because there is just less smudging with these types of pencils, and I can I can just put in those dark areas first and then work in the lighter areas later without worrying too much about messing things up. I'm using a burnt ochre for some of these yellowish parts of the fur, but I'm not going to leave it like that. As you can see, I'm adding some other colors there. I'm adding some browns, mostly burnt sienna and burnt umber. And of course, I'm also refining those darker patches by working around them, adding some smaller strokes with my black colored pencil, but also with some brown pencils such as burnt sienna and that dark brown, that burnt umber. So that's basically how I'm doing these patches, and there's going to be lots of them. There's going to be a lot of them in this drawing, and the whole drawing process is going to take a lot of time. So I decided to break this video into two parts. They will both be fairly long, but the reason why I did that was because the drawing process itself was a little bit longer, and I wanted to be able to show as much of it to you as possible, and I also wanted to show some parts of that process in real time, or at least slow down the pace a little bit so that I can explain some of the things that I'm doing. I'm working on the eyes now, starting with the left eye. Normally I draw from left to right because I'm right-handed, and I do that to prevent smudging. It's just a natural way of drawing, but with colored pencils, smudging is not that much of an issue, but it's just the way I normally do things. And now I'm working on the eye, and I'm going to put several different colors in there. I want some bluish, grey bluish tones. First I put some light grey in there, and then I put some of this darker blue. And I was already liking the color that I was getting, but I needed to leave a little bit of the white space around close to the pupil to have that reflection in the eye, to have that catch light. And because it's easier to do that by reserving the white space than by erasing, I decided to work around that white space. And I shaded this upper part of the eye, under the eyelid, a little bit more, adding a bit more value to make it just a bit darker, and I added a touch of blue on top of that. Now, if you want to make your eyes look a little bit smoother, I'm adding a touch of texture there as well, but if you want to make these eyes a little bit smoother and a little more realistic, because the eye is a round, smooth surface, if you want to achieve that effect, you can actually use a white colored pencil for blending, and let me show you again how I would do that. So I'm just going to do a quick drawing, a quick sketch of an eye. Again, I'm drawing a darker area under the eyelid because that's where you would expect a bit of shadow. I added a bit of blue and a bit of green, and as you can see now, that has a bit more texture than you would want. And if you want to make that a little bit smoother, what you can do is you can use a white colored pencil on top of that, and you can see how nicely all of this is being blended and kind of muddied together, and it looks pretty good. It looks fairly smooth, so you can use that to your advantage because it removes some of the texture and blends things together. But you have to remember that this is also a double-edged sword, as it were, because you have to use a bit more pressure, and the colored pencil will burnish the paper, and then you will lose that texture. So the amount of layering and the details you will be able to put in later will be limited by the burnishing you've already put down on the paper. So I've pretty much finished that eye, and now I'm working around the eye using that light colored pencil, the ivory pencil, and adding some slightly darker ochre tones around it. So that light colored pencil that I initially used is not exactly white, it's kind of like yellowish white, It's a very light colored pencil, but just a little bit darker than white, as you can see, and it has a yellowish tone, and it blends pretty well with this burnt ochre. And I'm using that ivory colored pencil for the lighter patches of the fur, or the lighter areas of the fur. Now, if you look at leopards and similar animals, you will see that they have some areas of lighter fur around the eyes and around the mouth area, and also around the neck and the chest and the belly area. So I'm going to be using a little bit more of this ivory color for those lighter areas, and then I'm going to be gradually adding some of that burnt ochre for the yellowish fur, mixing that, or rather layering that, with some of the browns I'm using. I'm doing a bit more drawing of these darker areas, these darker patches of fur, these spots, if you will. And here down the middle they appear to be a little bit more dense, because that's kind of where the fur meets in the middle of the head. So I'm going to try to reflect that with my pencil strokes. I'm making my pencil strokes so as to suggest the flow and the direction of the fur. I already mentioned that when I did that small demonstration on how I draw these darker patches of fur. I'm moving on to the other eye here, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the left. The skin around the eye is fairly dark, almost black, and there's going to be a nice contrast between the eye and that dark area. And I'll also have another catchlight or reflection in the eye as well, and I'm going to use the same tones. I want the eyes to be a little bit bluish. I'm doing a bit more work on the other ear. As you can see, I drew the shape of the ear on the right, and notice that the ears are slightly swept back. And that's one of the interesting things about cats. They can rotate their ears sometimes independently, and when they're swept back like this, they're probably rotating their earlobes so that they can hear something in the background, something behind them. And the reason why I chose to do that with the leopard's ears is because I kind of like when cats do that with their ears. I used to have cats, and they have such interesting body language, and they can do some funny things with their ears. Well, this is a larger cat and a more dangerous one, obviously, but there are many similarities. It has many similarities with its smaller domesticated relatives. So as you can see, I've put down most of the darker patches in the top part of the head, and now I'm going in between, adding those areas of yellowish fur using that burnt ochre. And if I sometimes feel like I need to add some more yellowish tones, I will add some yellow and some orange on top. I want to show you how I'm approaching the drawing of this fur, because I'm doing this kind of carelessly and a little bit quickly, too quickly maybe, some people would say. The better way to do this is to use a tapered stroke like this, because a tapered stroke allows you to create more seamless transitions. But what I like to do when I like to get things moving very quickly is I just go back and forth like this, and I create smaller patches of fur like this, and I do that in order to imitate short fur. On an animal, this looks a little bit ugly, I'm not going to lie. It looks a little bit ugly at first, but you can always refine it a little bit by going back and changing the direction a little bit. And naturally, you're also going to be adding some other colors to it. You're going to be adding some darker colors, like for example this burnt sienna, as well as some other tones, which will make that fur look a little bit more interesting and a little bit more realistic. So I have a lot of work here to do on the top of the head. I need to cover a lot of that fur using that yellowish burnt ochre. And like I said, if I feel like I need some more yellowish tones, I can just drag my yellow pencil or this orange pencil on top of that, so that I can get some slightly warmer tones. Here I'm going over this lighter area of the fur, and I'm putting down some work with an ivory pencil, but I'm going to be going over some of those areas with an ochre. So I first put down the ivory pencil, and then I go over it with ochre. This is important to remember because colored pencils, they can be layered, but they have a slightly different effect depending on which one you put down first. So if you put down the lighter one first, like I just did here, it will affect the color you put on top of it, and it will become lighter. So that's what I'm trying to achieve here, because I want to create some transitions between that area of very light fur and those areas of slightly darker yellowish brown fur. And I want some transition areas where the fur is kind of something in between. And I'm going to do that by putting down this ivory colored pencil first, and then putting down that ochre on top of it here and there. Now I would like to be able to tell you that you should control your pressure when you're doing this so that you can layer more successfully, but I'm not going to lie, I'm actually not really controlling my pressure too much. I am sometimes pressing a little bit harder, mostly because I am a somewhat impatient person, but also because I think when you're working on regular paper like I am, sometimes in order to get the most out of your colors, you do need to press a little bit harder, I'm afraid. Anyway, as you can see, once I put down that sort of a base color, that ochreish color, I'm going back in and I'm adding some touches of darker color, and I'm making sure that I'm using those short strokes to imitate that slightly shorter fur on the top of the head. And I'm adding those darker marks, not just to create a little bit more variety of colors in the fur, but also to create a little bit more depth in the fur itself. So I'm going to control the amount of those darker strokes, those strokes that I create using a darker color, like for example this burnt sienna, which is like a reddish brown. And I'm going to be using that to basically shade the drawing while at the same time doing the texture, because in those areas where I will be adding a little bit more of that brown, those will be the shadow areas at the same time. So I will use those darker areas, and I will use that darker colored pencil, that reddish brown, to express volume and depth in my main subject. Because if I used only one color, obviously the drawing would look very flat. So it's not just about the texture, it's not just about these tiny details, it's also about showing the shape of an animal and showing the larger relationships between areas of lighter and darker value. And that's something that you really need to keep in mind, because you can get caught up in drawing all of this texture, but if you don't shade the animal so that we can see that there are some lighter and darker areas, then all of this work you did on the fur will kind of be a waste of time, because you will fail to capture the three-dimensional shape of your subject. And notice that I'm often using that reddish brown to work around these darker patches, and that's because I want to make it look like the patches of darker fur are gradually getting lighter and blending into the lighter fur, and I want to make it look like they're gradually becoming darker and darker. So I like using black when I'm drawing, even though some artists recommend against that. But I like using black, and I combine that with some other colors in order to get the effect that I want. And I will mostly work around those dark patches using some browns in order to make that look more realistic, like actual fur, because these dark patches, as I already mentioned, I don't really think they are completely black. I think they're a mixture of something like a dark brown and dark ochre and black. I'm not really sure. I'm doing a little bit more work on the eye here and a bit more blending with a white colored pencil, as I already showed you before. First I lay down some of the details and I add a bit of texture, and then I soften that texture and go over the entire eye using a white colored pencil, and then the eye looks really a lot smoother. It looks like a really smooth surface. So that's why it's a good idea to use a white colored pencil as a burnishing tool, not just as a drawing tool. But the eye of the leopard does have some of these spots, some of that variation in color. So I try to capture those as well, even though I'm not really an expert in wildlife. I'm just trying to make this look as convincing as possible, but I don't really know that much about either the leopard's eye or the eyes and the anatomy of other big cats. I just wanted these eyes to be a little bit more on the bluish side. So let me get back to what I was saying about dividing this footage into two videos. The second part of the video will be coming soon. I will try not to make it too long a break before I publish the second one, because I know that some of you will want to see the entire drawing process. And the entire drawing process took, honestly, I don't know exactly how long it took, because I didn't record all of it. I made some breaks and I tried to record most of it, but I think the drawing process was at least 7.5, 8 hours. It might have been more than 8 hours, which is a little bit longer than most of my drawings, and there are two reasons for that. First, because the drawing is slightly larger and more complex, and the second, and probably the main reason, is the fact that colored pencils, as fun as they are to work with, sometimes they are a little bit slow to work with, because they cover large areas very slowly and they don't blend that well. So those are some of the disadvantages of colored pencils. That's why I've been lately experimenting with colored pencils on some other media, like for example sandpaper, or on a surface covered with clear gesso. And like I said here, I was also thinking about doing this on a paper covered with clear gesso, on a toned paper, but it didn't really work out that well. I didn't really like the effect I was getting, so I decided against it, and I just didn't want that texture that it was creating. Maybe I should try diluting the clear gesso even more, but so far I haven't been able to get the results that I wanted. I imagine that if you're able to find and afford high quality, artist quality sanded papers like Pastel Matte or UArt or some others, working on those with colored pencils is a lot of fun, no doubt, and you can also get different tones of paper and different sizes of paper, but these are not available here, and they're probably too expensive anyway, because I would never be able to earn a sufficient amount of money to cover the expenses. So I think I'm going to keep working on these with these slightly cheaper materials. But my pencils are not cheap. Faber-Castell Polychromos are a little bit more expensive. These are high quality, artist quality colored pencils. So I did the nose. I didn't do much narration there, and I also did a little bit more work on those darker patches of on the neck and on the shoulder area. let me just say a few words about how I did the nose. I used some flesh tones, that cinnamon and that Venetian red, and then I mixed that with some brown colors and added some black on top of that. Now the texture of the nose is a little bit more complex than this. The nose looks kind of simplistic and cartoony right now, but I'm going to be adding some texture and some details to it later. There are some darker spots on it and stuff like that, but so far I think the nose looks pretty good. Now I'm adding a gentle touch of that ivory lighter colored pencil to those lighter areas around the nose and the mouth. And I'm going to be layering over that using some of the darker colored pencils that I have at my disposal. All in all, I think I'm using about, I don't know, maybe 10 different colored pencils. It should be enough to do a nice colored pencil drawing of a leopard. And I didn't really pick this subject myself. This was a commission drawing, but I decided to record the drawing process because I thought that a lot of people would want to see this on YouTube as well as Patreon. And speaking of Patreon, if you want to see longer videos with more narration and with more footage, you should go there, because I have plenty of full-length narrated videos on my Patreon. So if you want more content, you should go there. If not, just browse through my channel. I have lots of drawings of wildlife, as well as other things such as landscape, portraits, many other things, even still life. But wildlife, and especially African wildlife, these animals always make for fascinating subjects, especially these big cats. And I think it's been a while since I've done a colored pencil drawing of a leopard. Now let me get back to explaining what I'm doing right now. I'm drawing the texture of the fur on the nose, and this is a very, I'm not going to say difficult, but kind of tedious part of the drawing process, because short fur is usually a little bit more difficult to draw than longer fur, because you have to make all of these tiny short strokes to imitate the appearance of the short fur. You can't let your hand go, and you can't let it produce strokes that are too long, otherwise the fur won't look realistic. These are some of the things that an artist has to be aware of, but people who look at the drawings who don't really know how to draw, they can still pick up on these things, and they can still see whether something looks realistic or not. So for example, the length of the fur here, they can't really tell if they don't really know what the artist did there, but they can see if you made strokes that are too long, the fur just won't look convincing. But if you're patient enough, and if you make these short strokes to imitate the appearance of very short fur around the nose, then the eye of the regular person who doesn't know anything about drawing will still pick up on that, and they will still perceive that as realistic looking fur. I added some darker pencils on top of those marks that I created with that ochre color, and now I'm adding some of these darker dots and spots to imitate those smaller shadow areas in the fur. Basically, I'm trying to add a little more depth and texture to the fur on the nose, but at the same time keeping that appearance of the short fur. If I were doing this in black and white, things would be way simpler, obviously, because here I have to worry about different tones. But if I were working in black and white, I would have to find a way to express that contrast between those lighter areas of lighter fur and areas of darker fur. Here, as you can see, I chose the lighter ivory colored pencil to be my main pencil for the lighter areas, and I chose the ochre and the browns for the darker fur. I'm drawing some indications of fur around the nose here, and I'm drawing some indications of darker fur using a brown, that burnt umber, around the sides of the nose especially. And it's always very important to shade the sides of the nose, whether you're doing human portraits or animal portraits, because the nose is one of the most 3D parts of the face, and it's kind of protruding, it's sticking out, and if you want to be able to convey that shape to the viewer, if you want to be able to explain to the viewer that that part of the face is sticking out, you need to shade the sides of the nose so that the tip of the nose is a little bit lighter, and so that it feels like it's sticking out. If you don't do that, if you don't shade the sides of the nose will end up looking too flat, and then you won't be able to create a very realistic looking subject. That part of the drawing is coming along nicely, and I've already done the greater portion of the fur on the face. I'm not going to be doing the whiskers just yet. I'm going to be doing that in the second part, and I'm going to explain how I do those. You can do those without actually using some white gouache or gel pens. You can actually do that by erasing and using a white colored pencil. Not always, but I'm going to show you how I do it. Here I'm just kind of blocking in these larger areas of slightly darker fur, this yellowish fur, and once I block those in, I'm going to be refining them later using the same approach that I've already used, by adding some browns and things like that. I'm just going from one part of the drawing to another, adding some details. Here I'm adding some details to the nose here. You can see how I made the texture of the nose a lot more interesting and realistic, and I also added some bluish tones to the shadow areas of the animal to make them a little bit more realistic. And now I'm adding a bit more texture to these areas of lighter fur here, because I don't want the lighter fur to appear too flat either. And I first added a touch of those, a touch of that burnt ochre, and after that I proceeded to add a few of those shorter strokes of darker brown. So if I feel like I lost some of the contrast, I can always do a little bit of erasing to make those areas of lighter fur even lighter. Now notice how I made this irregular edge around the jaw area, around that chin area. There will be some lighter hair, slightly longer lighter hair there, and I wanted to create that interrupted edge so that I can draw those lighter white hairs which are sticking out almost like a goatee of some sort. And there are also some, the gums on the mouth are darker, they're black, and there are also some patches of darker fur around the gums, or on this lower part of the jaw. There are some bluish tones in here around the mouth, and I'm just going to keep adding some more texture to this part of the lighter fur around the jaw area. So for this first part of the video, I'm going to be doing about 2/3 of the face and a little bit of blocking in on the left side of the body. But I'm going to do a little bit more work on the eye here, adding some indications of spots around the eyes. And one of the things that you'll notice when you're drawing animals like this, which have spots or stripes, is that the animals are usually asymmetrical in terms of the distribution and the size and the shape of those spots. And that's okay. You don't have to try to make them look symmetrical. In fact, if you make them look asymmetrical, then the animal will be more realistic looking, more natural looking, and there's no reason why you should be trying to achieve perfect symmetry. This also makes our job a little bit easier, but I think even though you shouldn't try to achieve perfect symmetry, you should try to achieve some symmetry in terms of the distribution of these smaller and larger patches of darker fur, so that the two sides of the animal's body at least look kind of similar. There are these horizontal interrupted darker patches of fur around the nose on both sides. That's where some of these whiskers will be growing out of, but I'm going to be adding the whiskers a bit later. Like I said, I'm saving that for part 2. Here I'm just going to draw some more of these darker patches by scribbling with my black colored pencil, using a short back and forth motion, and also shading a little bit around the jaw area, just to make that both the jaw and the areas of lighter fur pop out a little bit, so that I can make the leopard look more three-dimensional. And I still do have a lot of work when it comes to the placement of these patches of darker fur. I've already explained why I like to put in these first. That's usually my approach when drawing animals like this. Drawing these darker patches first just helps me navigate through the drawing a little bit more easily, because this is a very, very complex subject, and when I put in these darker areas, these spots or stripes, whatever animal I'm drawing, it just kind of makes the drawing process a little bit easier and a little bit more relaxing. I did use a bit of brush here and there. I don't know if you've noticed, I did use a bit of brush for blending, but I didn't use it too much. So that will be it for this first part. I'm going to see you in the second one. Don't forget to check that one out as well. Bye for now.